Trump's former lawyer and fixer Michael Cohen is preparing for up to 3 years in prison after taking responsibility in court and in public for crimes he insists that he largely committed on Donald Trump's behalf, while the president openly blasting Cohen now as a, quote, rat, a term typically used by criminals trying to dissuade others from telling the truth about their crimes. An incriminating pattern of Trump publicly interfering in criminal investigations is obviously here for all of us to see. This is part of a larger trend, urging witnesses not to testify, which legal experts say that only builds the obstruction case against President Trump. Let's get right into it now. I'm joined by Lanny Davis, who is a former lawyer for Michael Cohen and a former lawyer for the Clintons. Thanks for coming on the beat tonight.
You're welcome, Harry.
Let's start with the larger context, not just Michael Cohen, who you have previously represented, but the way that Donald Trump seems to blatantly discourage or even punish cooperation with law enforcement. What is your view of that?
Well, let's just assume it was not the President of the United States where the issue of obstruction of justice and witness tampering could be the subject of an indictment. Donald Trump should be indicted for calling a cooperating witness a rat and for praising people who are obstructing and refusing to cooperate. Remember, Michael Cohen is the one person who fully cooperated with the special counsel, 70 hours, 7 meetings, and yet Michael Flynn gets no jail time, and Michael Cohen gets called into the Southern District of New York offices on the Friday before the Monday, and he's told either plead guilty or you're going to be indicted. Well, I want to get to that. Something is off with that.
I want to get to that, Lanny, but before we get to that, when you say your assertion here on the news tonight is you think the president's effectively committing felonies, then on that alone, what should be done about that?
Well, nothing but the Congress acting, or when he leaves office, which I assume will be in 2021, he will be prosecuted for a number of crimes, not the least of which is paying hush money that corrupted an American presidential election. But we certainly know that calling a cooperating witness, and you're the head of the law enforcement offices of the United States government, and deterring people to cooperate and tell the truth the way Michael Cohen did is an obstruction of justice and should be penalized.
When you say penalized, if it's obstruction, what do you think a legitimate Congress should do about it?
Well, I'm not ready to decide on impeachment unless I see evidence of a bipartisan effort. We've been down the road of a partisan effort on impeachment in 1868, which historians have found to be illegitimate in 1998 and 9 with President Clinton. So I need to see Republicans stand up to a president that is not only lawless, but they don't seem to have the ability to stand up to at least demand that he tell the truth. But right now, I don't think the country's ready for impeachment. I think Democrats need to solve the country's problems and not focus too much on the big I word.
Well, interesting from you on the I word, and you have a lot of relationships in the Democratic Party as well. Now turning, as I promised, to your point about this debate over cooperation. For your response, let's just read an important part of what is alleged by the federal prosecutors in New York that some people may have missed, because they say that Mr. Cohen, your former client, declined to provide full information, wouldn't be debriefed on the other uncharged criminal conduct, as they put it, and that's why they explain Cohen's not being offered a cooperation agreement. Lanny, based on your knowledge here, which is deep in this case, is that a fair characterization? Did Mr. Cohen get more time than Michael Flynn because he didn't fully cooperate?
Well, I'm not sure what they're talking about, to tell you the truth, so I can't really explain what they have said. I know that Michael Cohen asked to be heard frequently before the Friday, before the Monday. And they said no. They talked to his lawyer, but he wanted to go in and talk to them about this very complicated tax charge, a bank issue that turned out to be a false statement, not a fraud charge. And then, of course, the campaign finance violation. And they said no. Now, why would they not allow Michael Cohen to come in until on the Friday afternoon with a gun at his head, basically either you plead guilty or we're indicting you on Monday. They've never responded to that. Guy Petrillo, Michael's lawyer, put that in the sentencing memo, and none of the media picked up and asked the Southern District, why wouldn't you allow Michael Cohen to come in before you presented him with an ultimatum with 3 days to go? That's the unreported story, whereas Michael Cohen did spend 70 hours with the special counsel.
Well, that's the
and I was
contrast.
hoping Mr. Mueller would tell the Southern District, listen, it's a lot more important, the focus that I have on a president that may have colluded with Russia, than you're bringing somebody in on a Friday and not giving him any time to talk.
Well, Lanny, I think you're putting your finger on something important. It's a contrast a lot of legal experts, and I think some journalists, to be fair, have noticed. I don't know that we know the bottom of it. You mentioned Mr. Petrillo. This is what he writes. He said, look, Mr. Cohen's wary of a long-term cooperation agreement. He wants both to remove himself and remove his family from the glare of the cameras, but arguing, as you have, that Cohen did provide a lot of information. At the end of the day, what is the takeaway here? Is it that federal prosecutors in New York were tougher than Mueller or less fair than Mueller?
Well, I used the word in my own statement, they lack proportionality. Michael pled guilty to the offenses he was charged with. He took ownership, personal responsibility, no excuses. That's not my criticism of the Southern District prosecutors. My criticism is they hid the ball and they didn't tell the media. We did not allow Michael Cohen to come in and talk with us. And to this day, they've never explained that. To say it's because he didn't sign ahead of time a full cooperation agreement when he spent 70 hours with Mr. Mueller, which is full cooperation according to Mr. Mueller, who complimented him on disclosing the core issues facing both Mr. Mueller and the country, which is whether this country was compromised by the President of the United States with the Russians. I called it a lack of proportionality and poor judgment. But Michael owned up to the offenses and pled guilty.
It is an important and fascinating part of this case. After a lot of headlines that come out, we're going to stay on it. And Mr. Lanny Davis, with a lot of experience in this field, I appreciate you coming on the beat.
Thank you, Ari.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSNBC. You can see more of our videos right here, or better yet, subscribe to our YouTube channel below. You could have been anywhere in the world, but you're here with us, and we appreciate that.